Okay, we're ready to start chapter 24, the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. So this one's pretty foundational when it comes to macroeconomics because it introduces a critical framework for understanding how the overall economy functions, particularly as it regards to output, employment, and pricing. So we looked at supply and demand in the micro economy, but in the macro economy, we're not looking at supply and demand. We're looking at total supply and total demand, which is what we mean by when we say aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Bigger picture stuff here. The next two chapters after this one are then going to each go into even further detail about the different perspectives, supply in one and demand in the other. So we've got a lot to cover here with this information. Okay. So our agenda here, we're going to start by examining different macroeconomic perspectives on demand and supply. Then we'll understand why economists have historically emphasized one over the other. We also need to build the core aggregate supply and aggregate demand model itself, defining some of its components and how they interact. Then we'll explore the various factors that can cause shifts in aggregate supply and aggregate demand, leading to changes in the economy's equilibrium. Finally, we'll see how this ADAS, aggregate demand, aggregate supply model helps us to understand macroeconomic goals like economic growth, unemployment, and inflation, and then how it incorporates concepts like Keynes' law and Sez's law. We're going to talk a lot more about Keynes in the next chapter. So let's start with just our introduction. We're set the stage by looking at a significant recent economic event, which was the housing bubble and the subsequent housing burst after the 2008 global financial recession. So from the early 1990s through 2006, the United States saw a substantial expansion in its housing market. Home ownership rates steadily climbed from 64% to a high of over 69% by 2005. During this period, securing loans to build new homes became widely accessible, and mortgage values tripled. Housing was increasingly viewed as a safe and lucrative financial investment, leading many people to either purchase their first homes or upgrade to larger, more expensive properties. New single-family home sales peaked in 2005, reaching 1.3 million units. So rapid growth, fueled by easy credit and rising values, created what economists later called a housing bubble. But the rapid ascent of the housing market did not last. As this graph here illustrates, the number of new single-family houses sold consistently rose from the early 1990s up until its peak in 2005. I'll see if I can highlight that section here. There we go. Right. But then in 2006, the trend reversed sharply, and we start to see this downturn, very sharp downturn. And that was really the first time in decades that housing prices in the aggregate, not the individual markets, right? We're not talking about the micro markets of Huntington, West Virginia or Los Angeles, but in aggregate across the entire United States economy, home prices started to fall. It never really had done that before, or at least not in recent memory. So the number of sales here dropped sharply, and then it continued its decline all the way through 2011. And then the market began to show some signs of recovery starting in 2012, with sales beginning to climb back up. But the levels are still below the peak seen in the mid-2000s as of 2020. And today is 2025, so this graph doesn't extend that far. But this has had very long-term consequences because we are still seeing that this rise that has started here, it's still rising. Housing prices right now are very, very high. Yet the number of new households being sold hasn't really peaked the same way that you see in this graph. But pricing for houses is really high right now, and there's a limited supply of housing because in 2008 we just stopped building them. Imagine what this did, right? When these sales started to plummet, the market got smaller. We stopped building houses like we had been for many years. And so now in 2025, we're kind of grappling with this because there are not enough new housing inventory for the population. And so what's that doing? It's rising prices. It's putting price pressure on the existing inventory of houses. So long-term consequences. Signs that the housing bubble was precarious started to emerge in 2005 we began to see an increase in mortgage delinquency and late payments, alongside a growing oversupply of new homes on the market. So as these issues mounted, home values started to drop. Again, had not really happened before. The decline in home values had a big impact on households, reduced their overall wealth, caused them to pull back on their spending. The ripple effect was substantial because several mortgage lenders were unable to sustain their operations and were forced to file for bankruptcy because homeowners simply were not making their payments. By 2008, this localized problem had metastasized and spread throughout the broader financial markets. Lenders responded by severely restricting access to credit. They were often unwilling or unable to extend credit to otherwise credit-worthy customers, effectively freezing many economic activities because people couldn't get money and access to capital. This widespread contraction of the credit market then led to the bursting of the housing bubble. The bursting of the housing bubble and the ensuing crisis in the financial markets were not really that isolated. There were major catalysts for what became known as the Great Recession. And this period, from late 2007 to mid 2009, saw a severe economic downturn in the United States, leading to widespread job losses and a significant contraction in economic output. Unemployment rates soared, reaching over 10%, and the nation's GDP experienced a substantial decline during this period. We didn't just call this a recession, we called this the Great Recession. It was very nearly a depression, and I think that's something that we've talked about and will continue to talk about. In response to this severe economic distress, the US government and the Federal Reserve implemented some aggressive fiscal and monetary policies aimed at stabilizing financial markets and stimulating economic activity. We will definitely talk about that more in a later chapter when we talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy. So while the United States continues its recovery from this Great Recession of 2008, considerable progress has been made in restoring stability. And of course, we had a little bit of a relapse during the COVID recession, but we're still fairly strong. The economic history of the US and many nations is fundamentally cyclical. It features recurrent patterns of economic expansion, followed by recessions, and then subsequent recovery and growth. So while some of these fluctuations are relatively mild, others can be very severe, like the downturn of the Great Depression in the 1930s, which persisted for several years and had devastating effects. These cyclical behaviors prompt some questions for economists. Why does the economy grow at different rates in different years? What are the underlying causes of these expansions and contractions? So we've got to talk about these complexities in order to understand the dynamics of economic growth and unemployment over time, and that's what this chapter does. It introduces an important new tool, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, which is going to help us to explain these complexities. So understanding these economic cycles, the boom and the bust cycle, the growth and the recession cycle, and the interconnections between them requires a good analytical framework. So consider some of the questions that we grapple with. How is the rate of economic growth connected to changes in the unemployment rate? Why do unemployment and inflation often seem to move in opposing directions? For instance, lower unemployment typically coincides with higher inflation and vice versa. And we saw this in periods like the late 90s or during the 2009 recession. And why did the current account deficit, which is essentially the balance of trade in goods and services we talked about in the previous chapter, why did that rise before significantly declining in 2009? So to answer those kinds of questions, we really have to start discussing macroeconomic issues, not in isolation, but as part of a comprehensive framework. And that's what this model will help us to do. It brings in supply and it brings in demand, and it helps us to capture the relationships and the interconnections between the different economic variables at play. So this model is precisely that kind of a tool. It allows us to understand what determines total supply and total demand for an economy, and crucially, how these two forces interact with one another to establish a macroeconomic equilibrium. It also provides a framework for analyzing how shifts in either aggregate demand or aggregate supply can impact this equilibrium, leading to changes in the overall level of economic output and prices. Remember back from microeconomics when we had our supply and demand curves, they often shifted to the left or to the right, right? With technological innovations and things of that nature. So furthermore, this model is vital because it connects directly to the three primary goals of economic policy, which is achieving sustained economic growth, maintaining low unemployment, and keeping inflation in check. When we talk about the Federal Reserve, two of those three goals are within the purview of the Federal Reserve, right? The unemployment, low unemployment, and low inflation. So, or full unemployment and low inflation around 2%. And then the goal of achieving sustained economic growth, that's a secondary goal for the Fed. It's really the goal of Congress to try to make that happen from a policy perspective. So using this model, we're going to gain some insights into the connections and the trade-offs between our three important macroeconomic objectives. In the chapters that follow, we're going to then build on this model. The next chapter is going to focus on the Keynesian perspective, which explores the macroeconomy in the short run, where aggregate demand is particularly crucial in determining economic outcomes. Following that, the chapter on the neoclassical perspective will examine the macroeconomy from a long-run viewpoint, highlighting the role of aggregate supply in shaping the economy's potential. Both of these, despite their differing emphases one on demand and one on supply, both contribute to our understanding of the trade-offs and the interrelationships between those three goals: economic growth, unemployment, and inflation. So that's going to close out this chapter, and I will see you all, this section. I will see you all in the next one when we talk about macroeconomic perspectives on demand and supply.